Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. You're tuned in to Newcastle Fast FM. Welcome back to our Monday night show on the Baker broadcast. Assalamu alaikum from myself and our special guest, Dr. Abdul Baker. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa Islam Tilla.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Jazakallah khair for joining us again. Thank you very much. I was just checking my phone because I got a message telling me that I needed to check something. Something's gone live, and I've just realized it's me. It's this going live, but because I've subscribed, I'm getting notices that this is what I'm up to. So for our viewers, please do subscribe, like and get involved, inshallah. This discussion is as open as it can be, inshallah. We want you to be involved. We want you to connect, share with us your comments, share with us your thoughts, and we will try to engage as much as possible as we can throughout this next hour or so together, inshallah. Just wanted to quickly recap from what we did last week. Last week we discussed quite a few things, but along the core of our discussion was around the societal SWOT analysis. And this is part of what Dr. Abdul Haqq has studied, has brought to the fore, and is part of his work that he does internationally, mashallah, and with the UN as well, and I suppose in this week again at a conference digitally in the US. And so we were looking at sort of the SWOT analysis, and we drew a chart, and we looked at between the opportunity and the weakness. But those of you that know what SWOT is, it's strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So between opportunity and weakness, we had the hybrid identity. Between threat and weakness, we had resistance. Between threat and strengths, we had undetermined identity. So this is the place where people not quite sure where they're going to go, and they can go either way. They're kind of on that edge of which path to go on. And then between strength and opportunity, we talked about legitimized identity. I'm just going to bring that up to the camera. Hopefully that should be quite reasonably clear. Again, I have the writing of a doctor, but not necessarily the qualification as yet. So again, assalamu alaikum to all your viewers. Thank you for this, inshallah. We're going to continue the discussion around legitimized identity, looking at that quadrant where you've got strength and opportunity coming together, inshallah. And that's where we want to pick up. Yes, Dr. Abdul Haqq?
Right. That's right. And again, thank you for that summary. It means that what I said was explained clearly, alhamdulillah, from before. But what we want to look at in the legitimized identity, that's the ideal citizen. That's the ideal character. And from a religious perspective, if you remember the three categories that we discussed last week that Sheikh Hussain had given the classifications of the rightly guided youth, the youth who has corrupted beliefs, and the confused youth. And I think that the last one, the confused youth, was, as you mentioned, that hybrid identity, not quite, the undetermined identity, not quite sure which way they're going. And they're positioned in a very vulnerable area of society in that instance. And this goes in with the theme today, choosing your friends wisely. So the legitimized identity is that rightly guided character, that individual who is more certain about their identity. That therefore places them in a part of society or a position in society where they're able to progress, benefit, not only themselves, but others. And some may say that's an ideal, but it's a reality, because if that legitimized identity was in the minority, we would have chaos across the world. On the whole, the majority of people, of mankind, are in that legitimized bracket where they're law abiding. They strive for the common values of peace, security, cooperation. But as we've mentioned, that can change depending on the societal context. What changes in society? Is there repression from the government? Are there other factors like we're seeing in the West and especially in the US at the moment with what happened following George Floyd's death? If there's a change in how particular administration or government bodies like the police have changed tactics or deploy a particular tactic, that legitimized law-abiding identity can become a resistance identity in that quadrant where there are weaknesses and threats.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on something from that, because I know you did something in a conference in the US, and there was stuff you were talking about around I think, I mean, to be honest with you, I think just even labeling it white supremacy is problematic. I think it should be called a white supremacy delusion, and it should be pitched as that it is a delusion, and that it is a minority within that follow it, but it is a delusional mindset that one feels superior in that. But I think when we have a society which is based on the constructs that uphold that structure, because we've been looking at sort of where the Black Lives Matter movement is, and how it's starting to really unearth issues here in the UK. And, you know, like people like yourselves that I've spoken to, but even other people who work in various types of industries have talked about, you know, basically just because of the color of their skin and alongside their gender, they've been really sidelined or pushed to the side, and it becomes very easy as a construct to be able to push that to the side. And when we talk about a legitimized identity, that legitimized character of doing that, there has to be that safe space where one is in to be able to function and carry yourself out in that way on a day-to-day basis.
And I think that's an important point. I always talk about layers, as you know, and a macro and a micro level. So when we're talking about legitimized identity, that ideal identity, we need to look at two perspectives. There's one that society facilitates and wants you to be within, a bracket they want you to be in. Even those of us as Black individuals who are told we have made it. We have made it, if you like, according to dictates that they have placed upon us. So that's one construct. Then there's the other construct in which we want to ensure that legitimized identity is according to the parameters that we want to define for ourselves. Now, they will be microcosmic, but we will be able to have ownership of that. We will refuse to be token according to, like, for example, us as Black individuals, we were told you can make it in sports, you can make it in music. And some of us have invariably made it in sports and made it in music. And to an extent, some of that's from us, but that's a pathway and an arena that our, say, white supremacist idealistic society has allowed us to traverse. Some of us kick back against that and say, well, I'm not going to go into sports and I'm not going to go into music unless it's on my terms, saying things I want to say, doing things I want to do. We're going to go into a different pathway, be it science, be it academia, be it whatever. Some may say, but then they've allowed you to do that as well. That may be the case, but we are traversing the same trajectory that white Britons and others who have that by right, because of the infrastructure, are doing as well. We may have to work twice as hard, 3 times as hard to get there, but we're going to traverse that path by choice, not by the avenue that they have allowed us to, the path they've allowed us to be in that instance. So these two levels are very important for us to be aware of if we are to know ourselves and we're to know what the constraints are, as well as the opportunities within whatever society we're living in. But as you said, coming back to the white supremacist being a fallacy or an idealism, if you like, I would agree with you to an extent there. But because this is a infrastructure that white Britons, white Americans, former colonialists, imperialists, it's the premise of imperialism, have put in place, they've made that idealism become a reality. Why have they made it become a reality? Why has white supremacy become a reality? Because it's supremacy believing in their xenophobia that they are better than others. And they've put an infrastructure in place to enable that and to enact that. That's what structural racism is. That's exactly what structural racism is. Racism can be enacted against you and me by any white individual in society, knowing that they have the support or the facilitation or the recognition, tacit or otherwise, of the societal infrastructure and framework. Whereas you and I, we cannot rely on that same infrastructure and framework to enact or implement racist policy or behavior towards white Britons, because it's their system. White Americans, because it's their system that has been built and established for centuries now, from the transatlantic slave era. Now, if you say, some may say, well, how does that work? If we were in Asia now, Pakistan or India or any country in Africa, and we had the ability to implement the same structural division, marginalization against a minority, white or otherwise, then that would be black or Asian supremacy, because the infrastructure supports the indigenous people towards that and facilitating that marginalization, that racism against that minority not having any power to retaliate in kind.
And I think it's interesting you say about policy then, because there was because as you'll be aware, on Saturday and Sunday, so a lot of public places were open, all the bars were open, there was a lot of different things. I remember somebody commented on that, saying that because there was no social distancing, people not wearing masks, is very much a second wave coming. Whereas some people said, well, the best way to stop a second wave is not let the first wave end, because there's this perpetuation of risk that's been put there. But the reality is those people are there because the government has said they're allowed to do this. Right. They're not there. If the government had not, lessened the restrictions, then people wouldn't have turned up in those numbers. So
that's right.
So I suppose what I'm getting from what you're saying is that there are policies in place that people sort of follow, but it's that policy that's really guiding and deciding the divisions within a community, the hierarchy of how things and structures are. But if the squabble remains within the masses, and I think as long as it remains within the masses, as long as you and I are arguing between, who really is the best Premier League team in the world, as long as we keep that argument there, we're not really questioning that structure that is there, that is sort of being built and being maintained over us.
Right. Absolutely. And that's, again, part of the imperialist or structural apparatus to keep us distracted. You remember when we watched films like Gladiator, and you heard Caesar say, give the mob what they want, mobocracy. Give the mob what they want. They love the games. They love the blood. That will keep them distracted from the other political and issues that are underlying. And it's a similar strategy that's being deployed. And again, if we're looking more widely around the world, while we're focusing on George Floyd, while we're focusing on the pandemic, we're seeing annexations of aspects of Palestine, further annexations taking place by stealth that we've turned away, we've been distracted. So this is by design that this is actually taking place. But we've also got to be careful as well that we don't go to the other extent or other extreme, which is the conspiracy theories that are abound at the moment as well. And you'll see that there's a polarization between distrust of government, and rightly so, because we've seen a lot of deceits from various governments. And then you've got the conspiracy theorists on the other side, and they are conspiracies. But however, there are some that have more elements of truth to them that shouldn't be taken with just a pinch of salt. But it's difficult for us as the lay person to focus on the intricacies of these two polarizations. And because many of us are trying to do that, the level of stress and anxieties internationally, globally now, mental health issues and the like, have risen exponentially because of these juxtapositions and polarizations.
Yeah, and I suppose when you look at these polarizations, I think Sister Salwa just posted a comment. We'll just get that up on the screen, inshallah. But it's this idea that, so here we go. So when push comes to shove, ultimately things will explode if issues are not addressed and handled. And I think we've kind of, I don't want to keep repeating ourselves, but change ultimately comes when that push comes to shove. We've not seen anything, like I said, whether you look at the suffragettes, whether you look at any kind of so-called liberation or removal of a colonial power, colonial invaders from a particular place, it has come through that struggle. It has never come through from, everybody sort of sitting around a campfire and sort of saying, you know what, this would be a good idea and this is the right thing to do. So there is that issue that is still underlying, and I think sometimes, like I've worked in various things, and one of the things that I've always said is that it's not who's got the most fight to go for it. It's who can last in that fight the longest. Yeah,
that's right.
So your organization might be small, but you're not funded, or you don't get funding certain things. So the larger organizations just have to wait for you to kind of gas out, and then they'll step in. And that's really literally how I've seen large sort of governments and councils and things like that just wait it out because they can. They've got the means and the resources to do it.
That's a very good point. But then we have, which is, I think, excellent from the perspectives of faith. We have really good examples where we see singular solitude and of individuals. The prophets, peace and blessings be upon them, for example, righteous people standing for a cause, enduring suffering on their own. And we've seen that bring down societies. We've seen that bring down infrastructures. And some might say, okay, these are prophets of God, these are prophets of Allah, and they have that divine assurance. And that's understandable, but there still are examples. But then when we want to look more at contemporary issues, let's look at the last 50 years. Let's look at Nelson Mandela. Let's look at Malcolm X. Individuals who stood against systems, and they gave the ultimate sacrifice in some instances. Nelson Mandela, the incarceration period was not many of us could endure what he endured. Malcolm X, when you want to look at Martin Luther King, they gave the ultimate, which was their lives in this instance. They had support, obviously, but we saw individuals who had a vision, who stood against injustice, continued, galvanized the masses. Remember, that's a collective of individuals with no power or might behind them. And they stood and they proclaimed their voice, and those voices came together in unison. So whilst those conglomerates and these big caucuses and these governments, they do use the might of their apparatus against the masses, against the people. They do that. But like we're seeing now, that doesn't always succeed. When you see a global resistance, when you see a local resistance in that instance as well. So the change often comes from the grassroots. And that change, if it's consistent and sustainable, like how was slavery abolished? You've got Europeans saying it's because of us. No, let's look at Haiti, the most affluent or wealthiest of slave-owned properties and lands, and they revolted. They defeated the French, the British, the Americans. They defeated them because of their resolve to say no more. So we have that within us, that human element of resistance. Again, as people of faith, Muslims I will refer to specifically, we have that iman, we have that belief. We have statements from the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, where he told individuals of people being sawed in half and having their skin raked from their flesh, but that did not make them recant their belief. So we have that, and that's more powerful than any resource governments and institutions can place to prevent us from rising against injustices.
But that, I think it raises a very interesting question then for me in what you've just said, is that, yeah, we are looking for that change. But ultimately, as the Prophet ﷺ said, is that our leaders come from amongst us. Do you know what I mean? They don't drop from the sky. Do you know what I mean?
No.
They don't, no. They don't arrive in a package in an alien spaceship. They're from us. They're from our ilk, our community. They're, generation 2, above, below, whatever. They're from us. And we know that Allah says in the Quran that until a people change themselves. Yeah, there's no change that's going to come until a people change themselves. And this is why, as Muslims, this idea of revolution or of fighting something is something that is a little bit alien, because until the masses are ready for that change. The reactionary process is exactly that. It's reactionary, and it's just changing one person for somebody else. And just trying to think. Yeah, it was. I heard Dave Chappelle talk about Maya Angelou talking about the Machiavelli kind of principle, where if the people gather, put them into a pit, let them gather in a pit, and then when one of them rises, give him the villa on the mountain. Yeah, and if he doesn't take the villa on the mountain, kill him, basically, right? And this idea that when people come together, they will get a voice, but that voice will then be taken off and kind of lauded and given high status, but again moved away very much from the masses and held in that high esteem. And by doing so, and if that individual doesn't accept it, then yeah, deal with them. That's the Machiavellian way. But otherwise, you give them that, but you create that separation. Then the next person from that pit rises again. And so when I think about sort of the Malcolm X or the Martin Luther King, specifically the Martin Luther King, when people talk about the civil rights movement, it was just beginning with Martin Luther King. And as soon as he was martyred in that cause, the civil rights movement seemed to really slow down. It hasn't progressed as much as it should have done over the last 40 years. I mean, when you think about it, 40, 50 years, it's not far. It's a couple of generations away.
Two points there, and I'll deal with the last point you've mentioned first. I think that the civil rights movement has been hijacked, and that's from the UK perspective. When you look at that sort of movement there, racial equality, and from the US, and it's been hijacked by a myriad groups that have just been conflated with justice for Black people. And I don't necessarily subscribe to that dilution of that single Black cause. And Black Lives Matter, the movement, whilst they've raised to a degree the issue of Blackness and anti-Black racism to the minds of the world, and they can be commended for that, they are a contributory factor, significant contributory factor to that conflation and dilution as well at the same time of Black Lives Matter, the cause, because they have many other political causes and groups that they are representing. And we saw them emerge in London, the different marches that were taking place. And I'll be frank and open, LGBT and all these other marches that started taking place right under the umbrella of Black Lives Movement, the cause. And this happened in the UK as well. We've seen over the last few decades with the BAME conflating everyone together. So you have Black and everyone else. And some may feel, oh, this is controversial, what I'm saying. Why should it be? Because you don't see that with other entities. You don't see that with other pressure groups. They stand in solitude. They're very focused about what they're upon, and they won't take anyone else coming to conflate or join their causes with them. And I think that that's a problem. You're right with what you say about the civil rights movement. I would say it's because it's been diluted so much, and the Black issue comes up intermittently like it's doing now. But moving back to the earlier point that you made about Machiavellian politics, very good point that you've made, because that is the way of the system, and that is what Nelson Mandela was accused of into some instances. Malcolm X used to accuse Martin Luther King of being placated and only speaking within the confines of what the white supporters and benefactors would allow him to do. Malcolm X himself, initially, when he was with Nation of Islam, would not move beyond the premises or the parameters that Nation of Islam gave him. And when he left the Nation of Islam and embraced Orthodox Sunni Islam, he became freer. And in becoming freer, he was perceived as more of a threat, not to Nation of Islam only, but to wider society. Martin Luther King as well he started becoming more in tune, and along the same line, his parallel was drawn much closer to Malcolm X as well. And his message post the Watts riots, post visiting North America and seeing the condition and poverty of the black communities there, that radicalized his speech. His stance against Vietnam caused him many enemies from the former liberals that were aligned with him, and that made him even more dangerous in that instance. But I want to move to one point. I remember reading years ago a fictitious book called Pompeii, and what came from that story, talking about they were talking, was partly true, historical, about what happened to Pompeii, the volcano, Vesuvius, and everything. But one of the leading ministers said something on one occasion. He had a gathering and he had his guests there, and many of them were overweight. And he had some of the soldiers, the generals there as well. And he whispered to some of his friends, his overweight, affluent friends, and he said, always fear the individual in position who is slim and has that look of hunger in his eyes, because he will want to take your position. We want him to become like us, fat, overweight, affluent, no longer having any aspirations, because he's made it, because we have brought him in with us. And that always stuck with me. So don't worry, I'm not saying when we see a slim person, we're scared of him. We need to maintain that.
It's the analogy. It's the analogy and the understanding, that the idea that, because in those days, obviously, it was a different world, you know, no state to take care of you and all the rest of it. So it was, once you made it, you were looked after. Whereas, you know, and you could show it, you know, and but again, it's interesting you bring that up again, because it's that drawing of parallels of where do we and how do we connect with all of this, you know. I think because we have like this idea of, we've got these issues, we're going to raise them, we're going to get the justice we deserve, and we're going to get the policy effect that we're looking for.
Yes. What needs to happen is that there needs to be a clarity of purpose in what we are seeking. So, for example, with Muslims and the involvement of lending our voice to Black Lives Matter, the cause, we need to be very clear why we are lending our voices. And the primary reason is because we stand up against injustice. Now, alongside that has come the discussion about the statues and toppling of statues and what they represent. Generally, as Muslims, that's a non-starter for us, because conclusively, idols and statues and what they represent is something that is in polar opposite and contrast to our monotheistic beliefs. We don't do that for anyone or anything. So now we need to move that to the side, because we have a position, highlight what that position is, not diminish the argument that is there for those who are saying these images, these statues represent oppression, so they should go. We don't diminish that argument. However, we redirect the focus to living issues. We've got live things happening. We've got Black people being killed. We've got systemic racism that continues until now. There are the calls for reparations are even stronger, and yet you've got individuals from both sides of the fence, even amongst the Black communities, the more middle class bourgeois Black people, diminishing the argument about reparations, saying, and you've got the white voices are coming in as well, saying, oh, this was from centuries ago, we're not responsible for the ills of our forefathers. Okay, accepted, but that's easy enough to be said and done when you can look at 2015 being the final year that reparations were given to the slave owners and their descendants and the institutions that benefited from that. So what's good for the goose is good for the gander. So we need to be really focused on what the issues are, without it becoming as diluted and distracting as it has been now. Because some say, so what are we doing? Where are we? What is the argument? You've got those who are nostalgic towards the monuments and saying, well, Winston Churchill, he saved the war for us, which again is another issue that is a reality. So we hold him in that esteem. So even more polarization is being taken over this particular issue here, which should not be the distracting factor. If that's got to be a narrative that's taking place parallel to the main cause, then it should be the underlying current, not the main current that overtakes why we are focusing on Black Lives Matter as a cause today. So again, answering your point, focus is very, very necessary. And as Muslims, we have the guidelines and the premise of what to be focused on. The hadith again, enjoining good and forbidding evil. If you see an evil, if you can stop it or prevent it with your hands, then do so. If you are unable to do that, with your tongue, speak out against it, right? In that instance, if you're unable to do that because the circumstances are too repressive, then hate it in your heart. We have those guidelines. We have that focus.
I think it just brings it back to the discussion around the ideal character then that we just started to sort of look into, and that you are behaving in return of something bigger than yourself. You know, you are part of something bigger than yourself, you know, especially as you become part of society, part of community. And, you know, as you grow and you engage, whether that's to work, education, all of these other things, you're in there, you're part of the system, you're moving around in it. And like you said, it's about the enjoining of the good. And so what else is it that allows us to sort of reflect on what it takes to become that ideal character?
What we need to do, I think, first and foremost, we've got to look at the company that we are associating with. And I think this is an interesting point to come here in this instance, because where are we positioned within society according to that critical forces, the SWOT framework that we've discussed? What identity construct do we most identify with? So if we're in an undetermined space with regards to our identity, that places us in a vulnerable position. That places us between the strengths, and that places us between the threats. Are we being influenced by the more positive elements of society and the contact that we keep? If so, then we're moving in a right direction, and we are aspiring to those positive characteristics and traits that are actually there. If not, then we need to self-reflect and have a review of what we're doing, because the company that we're keeping is invariably going to affect us and our immediate environment. And I'll bring another narration to you, which I remember when I first came across this as a new Muslim, and I found it fascinating. That the narration, the hadith of the similitude of people being in a boat, and you had the people at the bottom of the boat, they kept going to the top to get water, and it was affecting or disturbing the people at the top of the boat. So they came to a conclusion: why don't we scuttle and make a hole in the bottom of the boat or the ship, and then we can get our water from there without bothering the individuals at the top. Now, the rest of the narration went, had they been allowed to fulfill or implement their plan, they would have sunk everyone in the ship. Now that ship represents society. That represents society. And the individuals at the boat, this is my analogy on that, if I may. And those at the bottom of the boat are those who are either youthful individuals, those of undetermined or hybrid identities, who do not see the bigger picture. They have a limitation with their experiences. They are not connected with the people of knowledge and those more mature individuals, my 4 stages again, those who have reached adult and mature phases. They're relying upon their rudimentary understanding of society. So they're saying, look, we don't need to go up to these individuals. They see us to be a pain and we don't know anything. So let's take from the bottom, not realizing they're going to sink the entire ship, themselves drowning first and foremost. So this individual who's got the undetermined identity needs to make sure that the company that he keeps are not of this category of people. And if they are, He or she needs to be a voice of wisdom to say, we need to connect to the elders. We need to connect with those who've got more knowledge. We need to connect with those with more experience, who are experienced. And those with more experience, they may be in that quadrant where there are strengths, where they've realized strengths of society. They may remain in that area where there are weaknesses, but they know how to address those challenges and contain those challenges and minimize those challenges, like an illness on your body. And you know how to contain it in a particular area without it spreading. People of wisdom know how to do that. They're not always given, as we've seen in some of the poorer societies, the ones that are more afflicted, they're not always given that plate of bowl of cherries. They've got to make do with the lesser. They have two evils, and they are dealing with the lesser of the two evils, and they're containing that, realizing this is our lot. The younger individuals, the youth, still need to learn from them and understand why. And I want to bring a very important point on that, what I'm saying about minimizing, but learning from those who have a restricted lot or restricted circumstances. Kanye West, who's now put in that he's going to run for president, yeah. I have to laugh at that because it is laughable. He first made that claim in 2016, I believe it was.
Yeah, it was a while ago. He sort of said it at a thing. And
yes.
He's been very quiet. He's been very quiet about everything that's been going on. And yes. To be honest with you, even Taylor Swift spoke up about it. Respect to her. She actually went out and said something. But yeah, sorry, go on. Yeah, it is, so, yeah.
Kanye West a few years ago mentioned, and I'm saying about when from the youthful perspective and the lack of comprehension, for him to have said that slaves being in that condition for 300 to 400 years was a choice. For him to have made such an outlandish statement, again, shows that lack of understanding and comprehension of the plight and what they had to deal with, what they had to endure, why some of them were placid somewhat, some, not all, because we know the resistance continued and continued and continued to the point that we are what's treading on their shoulders today, and can speak and live as we are in a land that wasn't originally ours. We had been, our forefathers had been shipped there. So that knowledge base, no matter where the elders are, no matter where the experience are they in an environment of strength and benefits, or are they an environment or community of weaknesses, risks, and poverty? Elders are posited in both of these environments, and we cannot shun one because we want to aspire to the other. We need to ensure, and we need to ensure that we are benefiting from both polar opposites from communities, whether our parents are affluent or whether we know uncles and aunties are in poverty. We need to understand that dynamic, because we may end up in either of them at any given time, or our children might end up in any given time. And if that doesn't happen, still we remember the hadith, the narration. Never look at those above you, because it's going to cause you disdain, envy, and such like. Always, when you're feeling down or dejected, look at those worse off than yourselves, and then you'll become more grateful to Allah that you're not in their plight or condition.
Yeah. It's just, I'm reflecting on that hadith about the boat. So at the bottom, we have the youthful people at the bottom. And just want to just quickly read out Sister Salwa's comment that we have the most beautiful deen, we have the most beautiful religion given by guidelines given to us, alhamdulillah. We are, mashallah, blessed people. We need to apply what we learn from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So I think that kind of balances with what I wanted to sort of bring up in the idea that you've got this boat and they're going up to the top level, but they feel like they're being a nuisance. Do you understand? So it's kind of like, I'm being a nuisance to these people. Isn't it better if I come up with an idea of my own and I don't have to bother these people again? So is that because where does that feeling come from? You know, why are these people feeling that nuisance, and why are they not connecting with those people? Because there's obviously a miscommunication that's happening there. You know, the people at the top must or should know that the people down below are going to come up for whatever's on the top level. They're going to need that resource. They're going to need it there, and it takes that nurturing and that idea of of bringing that I suppose it's looking at kind of where the fragments are within the community where we're not engaging and we're not kind of dovetailing to come together to support.
I think that's a good point. And it comes to, staying with the analogy of the ship from the hadith, it comes from understanding that with youth, there is that branch. It's a characteristic of youth, of youthfulness, impatience, thinking that we know everything already, thinking that our elders have become placid, cowed by the system, not understanding that the parents were once there. The analogy of the building that we discussed in Ramadan again, they're at a horizon that we're not at, but we are not considering that they can see much further than we are, and they were once at the level that we were at, so they know that what our horizons actually look like. So they're not doing that at the moment. And those at the top need to show that understanding and impart to them that they understand their ambitions, and allow them to come up to the top of the boat to witness how and when and to draw the water, and why it doesn't have to be done at a whim, that they need to know how to economize. They need to know how to get themselves to a particular level of understanding of life, of worldly matters, academia, religion. And then having that understanding, they will know that they don't have to come up every moment for water, small bottles of water, that they will come up less frequently with bigger containers or a system by which they can draw that water. Understanding, experience, learning from elders having that understanding of the condition of the youngers in society and facilitating their growth. That's another key thing, facilitating the growth of the youth, because some parents, some elders don't do that. We want the youth to grow in a manner that we have placed on them as confines. And sometimes and often our children and the young are better than that. They have more energy than that. But we are conditioning them in a way that we were conditioned by society. And so it becomes a perpetual problem. We've got to be very careful of that. We see a child of ours, or we see youth that we don't quite understand that they're not conventional like the other children. And we become worried about that. We become worried. We want to find a bracket to say there's an abnormality there, when it's not necessarily an abnormality. It may be a skill. This child may be a genius. Whether they've got a condition or not, there's still a talent and a skill there that we need to facilitate without clipping their wings.
Yeah, subhanAllah. It reminds me of when the Prophet ﷺ would go with Abdul Muttalib to the tribal meetings and sit and listen. And this is obviously going to have an influence. And I remember Nelson Mandela talked about it too. You know, he said that because his father was a tribal leader, and he said that he said that there was a manner that he learned from his father about how to listen, really listen quietly, absorb, and that experience. Because I think that's experience you can't learn from a book, and I think we kind of discussed this a while ago as well. Is that Islam seems to be kind of modularized, and that this is a bit of knowledge, this is a bit of knowledge, and it's kind of this pathway that you've walked it, you've studied it, you know it, but you haven't really walked it at all. And I think that's kind of what I'm getting from you, Abdul Haqq, is that you kind of have to have those spaces. You got to get into the pool and get wet. You got to get onto the bike and take off the sides and wobble and fall possibly, but have somebody there to kind of hold the back end and sort of go, okay, you know what, you're going for this.
That's right.
Or
that's
whatever
right.
The analogy you want to use. And I think we're not getting that intergenerational fluidity of things. I'm not saying it's because it's not a one-way process. It's definitely a two-way process.
And that's where, again, coming back to the identity constructs, coming back to the company that we're keeping, We spoke last week how the heart and the soul inclines to evil and negativity and the bad boy personas, as I had individuals with me when I was a bit of a naughty boy. And what we need to make our children understand, and what they need to understand, is their company defines them. You mentioned at the outset of this this show about the leadership that they come from among us. And we know from one of the Sahaba, I believe it was, when in the Kitab book, one of the Hadith books of Bukhari, I think it is, Kitab al-Fitan, when the youth came to one of them and said, look at what we have got with the leaders, we need to revolt. And he enjoined that against them doing that. And he said, we get the leaders we deserve. We get the leaders we deserve. Now with our children and their company, the companionship that they choose is going to determine how they're viewed societally and how they proceed societally. And if they're with individuals who have pessimistic, negative, resistant identities and outcomes, they can only move in that direction. And we only have to look in school. And I remember recently I was watching some interviews with some students, and it didn't happen as much in our generation. But what we saw was that some said they didn't like to answer questions correctly because they may be bullied or picked on as being nerds. So they would dumb themselves down to fit in with their classmates. And this is a common thing that happens now. So choose your friends wisely, because you will become of them. And if you're not of them, in order to fit in with them, you will start behaving like them. If you want to raise in rank amongst them, you may become more outrageous within the category of what makes that group unique or fun to be with. You will become more of a risk taker, less averse to risk. And in doing that, you're moving yourself away from your natural inclination, your natural fitra, and you will find that you will end up in a position or a very dark place at some point when you realize, when it's too late, that the friendship and the guidelines that you and your friends adhered to were very, very superficial. And we only have to look at what's happening on social media now. That social media, so many people are looking at what is being placed on social media and trying to live to those aspirations, which are by and large false, by and large fake, by and large unrealistic. And look at the unhappiness it's causing amongst who? Those with the undetermined identities, those who are still developing their characters because they're still malleable.
There's two things that really jumped out for me there from what you said, Abdul Haqq. One was around leadership, and not necessarily about the leadership that's sort of from the powers and so on and so on. Talking about personal leadership. And then the second thing you've said about when you kind of choose your friends because you're determined to get somewhere. And I think someone who has, like you mentioned, around self-defined or self-determination into what you want to do. If you genuinely want to be academically the best, you will find that group of people that are also having that same aspiration, because inevitability is that it's going to rub off on you. And if you're not able to find that circle, but you're undetermined, the chances of you connecting with that kind of group are diminished. So it's that knowing of yourself, like we're talking about this ideal character, is that you're able to define for yourself at least where your goals are. Now, obviously life happens, things change, that's all there. But at least you're able to say to yourself, this is where I want to be. You know, whether it's in 6 months, 12 months, 5 years, whatever it is, you know, this is where I want to be. So like you said, I mean, let's just use that the Instagram kind of lifestyle thing. You know, my friend was saying that, you know, it's Instagram is you on the best day. That's what it is. It doesn't show you the bad days. It doesn't show you the slog and the hard work. You know, it doesn't show you the effort you spend in the gym. You know, and there's a few videos coming out now, people talking about how difficult it is to maintain just the diet.
Right.
Never mind the workout.
Yes.
It's the diet. You know, you said you see this, you see us pumping all these weights and we look awesome, but what you don't see is when we put the weights down after that set, we're exhausted. You know, we limited our amount of water, we limited amount of carbs. We're just drained out, and we look the part, but we're not feeling that look of that part. And so I think then coming back to the ideal character, it comes to knowing kind of what you want then.
It does. And the only way that you're going to know what you want is spending those times on self-reflection, in your prayer, after your prayer, moments of dhikr. These things are really, really important, because in this fast-moving world today, we spend very little time on reflecting on who we are, what we want. And in this pandemic new normal, there's more time to reflect on that. And you're seeing even some of the celebrities saying themselves that they've had more time to be with themselves, their families, time to look and reflect upon their position in the world. You've got some entertainers realizing and saying how we've realized how insignificant we are because we're just entertainers. You've got others realizing that it was more for them that they were in the entertainment set field and industry than it was for anybody else. It was more for this self-gratification by external referencing and popularity. And now that they're not doing shows, and now that they're not in movies, a depression is setting in of sorts. And that all comes down to the space that we all have to reflect on who we are. And again, we have, as I think Sister Salwa highlighted, we have everything in this deen. Allah told us again, we've spoken about this, Surah Ma'idah, that he's told us that this day he has perfected our religion for us. And that's at every level, right down to our companionship. When you look at the best companions, that's why they're known as the Sahaba. Imagine we had companions like the Sahaba around us. Imagine what we would achieve and what our aspirations would be like. And we don't have Sahaba around us.
It's like, it's mentoring, isn't it? Really, it's, you know, what we would say in today's, in modern terms, is mentoring and coaching. Going back to that idea of, if you do go to the gym, there's a whole bunch of weights there. You might have seen some pictures and some videos of what to do with it, but it's, if you don't know what you're doing, you're going to cause yourself some damage, either short term or long term. Something's going to not work out for you, and it's having that kind of more foresight, really, subhanallah, as you said, that youthful stage of yes, that you go through these ideas of abstract, but you kind of need to sort of understand your purpose of life, where you place yourself. And that doesn't necessarily mean, because the career for life's gone, it went decades ago, but knowing who you are as defining yourself, as redefining yourself, or as this situation is now, is asking that question of us, like we said about entertainers or actors and other forms of art. People are asking that question of themselves. So, what is it that I am about? What is it that gives me that fulfillment? And given that we've had to slow down and take that pause.
Exactly. And as we're talking about that, you saw me look slightly distracted. I've given a book recommendation for the week, and I've sent that in the group. Hopefully Hassan will put it up. And Tina Rosenberg did a book, Join the Club, How Peer Pressure Can Transform the World. Join the Club, How Peer Pressure Can Transform the World, by Tina Rosenberg. It came out about 5 or more years ago, and she was a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, and hopefully Hassan will put that up. I'm featured in that because she looks at some of the work that I've done as well. And it was very interesting that she's talking about positive peer pressure. And I think this is a very good and appropriate book to recommend on this.
And that's kind of where I was leaning to, because that's where you can see your ideal character sort of shape and forming. The reason why I'm saying this is because I just want to, just personal for a moment, is when I was at uni, I was very much undetermined. All right, so I've gone from Newcastle, predominantly white community, to this place where there's just so many Asians, right, and they were just being themselves, and I could have gone in any direction, really. And alhamdulillah, I was blessed. I was really blessed with 2 brothers and specifically that from the local area that helped shape me. And then there were the brothers who shared residencies with me. May Allah bless you. I'm not going to call out any names, but there was one of my friends. There was a, well, it'll give away if I kind of identify him this way. But he was very patient with me, Abdul Haqq. He was really patient with me, and I don't think I've ever met. I've only met two people that patient, and one of them we used to. Yeah, one of them was a guy at uni, and another guy was at uni. But their friendship was that gentle steering away from that which, when I look back on it now, was definitely a harmful path for me to take down. You know,
right.
And so, and I was very much blessed with having these people who would just every now and then come and just gently steer me back onto the correct path. You know, alhamdulillah. And I think I was very blessed with that and very honored. And I say a lot of times to young people who I know and to close friends and family, I say I'm so glad, alhamdulillah, I didn't have Facebook when I was a young man, because trust me, I would never have got a job. I would never have moved on with my life. Never have got married. You know, nothing would have happened in my life, you know, if I'd been anyway documenting what I was thinking, never mind what I wanted to get up to. So astaghfirullah. So it was that friendship, those beautiful friendship. And just to give you an idea, you know, mashallah, like these are brothers that I've known for more than 2 decades. And I hadn't spoken to them for some time. You know, I'm talking good few months. You know, one of them I hadn't spoken to for about 4 or 5 years. And when my father passed away, you know, they traveled between the two brothers. You know, they traveled over 500 miles just to get to, about 400 miles just to get to the funeral, mashallah, of my dad. And that's just love and respect, you know. And you can't buy that, you can't fake that, and you can't forge it out of anything other than themselves, the people kind of stepping up and doing it. And you suddenly realize the value and the beauty of such friendships. And I think that's kind of where I was kind of feeling a lot of what you were saying, is that it is about those people that are around you that just work out who you are and strengthen you, but in a way that's positive, as you said, because there's the other direction as well.
And that thank you, Jazakallah khair, for sharing that. And I have friendship. I've got lifelong friendships with individuals since I was 4 or 5 years old, 6 years old, and we're still friends now, 50 odd years. And those are friendships you really cherish in that instance. And we've got to remember that what we're not saying here is that some may say, oh, are you saying we should only have that idealistic, legitimized identity, those who are in a good place in society that will push us in that same direction? Because we may not be in that legitimized identity position. We may be in an undetermined, as you've mentioned. We may be even hybrid. We've got that fluctuation between identities. We may be at resistance stage. You can still find in the resistance identity construct individuals whose resistance is positive. Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela, the prophets, the Anbiya, according to the societal constructs, were all in the resistance construct because they were resisting oppression. They were resisting a negative environment. So we must be careful that we don't say, legitimized identity good, resistance identity bad. No. From the societal perspective, they will always place resistance identity as a negative construct because it's going against them. But when we're looking from where we are standing, often resistance identities can be very positive. Now, let's flip the coin from a religious Muslim environment perspective, because you mentioned a very key point. Muslims are not taught, and it's not within our dictates to revolt and overthrow rulers. We've got clear guidelines on that, and we're not speaking to that scenario whatsoever. But within Muslim environments, we have scholars, we have students of knowledge advising leadership, advising rulership, whilst having elements of resistance, but being in the legitimized aspects as well, because they are part and parcel and intrinsic to the society. So there's a unique construct where that duality of identities can often be amongst our scholars. Some, you see many saying, oh, why don't the scholars speak openly against the rulers and their scholars for dollars? Because we have dictates that say you shouldn't do that, that you should advise the ruler behind closed doors as emphatically as you need to. And I'm not here to defend rulers and go into politics or anything. I'm speaking about what the religion says. My personal opinion won't come into that, and it shouldn't come into that, because we have prophetic guidelines within which to enact. But coming back to our context, the Western context now, many a resistance identity were, let's say, I'll use a new hybrid, legitimized resistance in that instance because of the oppression that was there in the wider societal context. What we're seeing in Hong Kong at the moment with the new laws that have been enacted on the people of Hong Kong, and they're saying they're going to continue to resist. They see that resistance as a legitimized resistance because of the repressive laws that are coming in from mainland China. So we need to remember that. We cannot say, oh, that child is bad, and what he said against the teacher or against the school or what he's standing for is bad, stay away from him. Because then if that was the case, we'd have people like Malala, what's her name, the Nobel Prize winning Pakistani. You've got her. You've got what's her name, Theta Grunberg, who's standing up for climate change and everything now at the moment. They are in resistant identity constructs, and they are evoking good. So again, resistance identities are not necessarily within a Western construct bad.
It's interesting, because I think what it also sort of highlights to me is that around your idea of okay, so we'll just have a read of that comment in just a moment. But just before we get to that comment, Dr. Abdul Haqq, is around conflict versus complementary. And I think that's kind of where this has kind of come up at an interesting point, kind of what you talked about, the different quadrants. If you could just read out that comment, please, for me, Dr. Abdul Haqq, on the screen.
Okay, yeah. We've got Aisha Vora. Assalamu alaikum, Aisha. She says, Salam, I have a friend that is saying our school is not looking at our accounts because of summer. So now we can cuss, meaning have a go. And I've warned her before and about other stuff. And she said, okay, I can go to hell. So I think what should she do? Good question, Aisha. You're advising her not to basically cause a storm by challenging the school about their financial administration, management or mismanagement, depending on who, which perspective you're looking at. And you've advised her not to do that. You've advised her not to go into challenging the school about that. And she said to you, you can go to hell. Let's talk about two things. First and foremost, you've given her advice and she's rejected it. You've done your job. Step back from that particular perspective. With your friend, she now needs to consider what are the likely outcomes of her or whoever with her raising complaints, maybe protesting against the school because of what it's doing. And how will that impact upon her and the rest of the students, positively or adversely? That's something that she needs to consider in that instance with the choice that she's actually making. And then if you're going to offer any additional advice to your friend in this instance, is what evidence does she have for the accusations and claims that she's going to be making? Because that's very, very important. Today, and I'll add to that, Sister Aisha, and for those who are listening, today, many claims are made without evidence. And unfortunately, we as Muslims are guilty of that. We will slander and malign an individual or individuals based on something we may have seen or context that we obtained from social media, mainstream media, something that they'd written, something that they'd said, but the context may not have been completely clear to us, or the circumstances of them saying and doing what they're doing. And this is a very important thing. We maligning another Muslim, we know about backbiting, how serious that is. That's saying something about someone that is true behind their back, that if they knew you were saying it, it would cause them harm and upset. And we know that a worse environment is slander, maligning an individual and saying about them something which isn't actually true. So we need to be very, very careful in this age that we're in. We see many accusations proliferating on social media. We see many armchair warriors, I say warriors and trolls, hurling abuse after individuals who make comments. And this seems to be their purview. Nothing constructive ever comes from them except negativity. The first advice would be to try and drown out and ignore those, because when you dwell upon them, their aim is to make sure they get into your mind, into your psyche, to affect your way of thinking and to either distract you so you start engaging with them, explaining and justifying yourself. And if that's not the case, then you start adopting a narrative that plays into their hands, and they can see that they're able to influence you with the malicious messages that they actually send to you. That's on social media. That's the one issue that we need to look at in that instance. And then we've got to be looking at things concerning people that we know. We've been told to make up to 70 excuses for friends and colleagues and fellow Muslims in what we narrate and what we hear narrated concerning them. And unfortunately, we've adopted a very Western culture in where we want to find out whatever salacious information we can concerning them, or if it's not that, if they make a mistake in what they've said, to trip them up and hold them to task about that error, and hopefully try to humiliate them in that instance. And again, these are traits that are not from us as Muslims. It's unbecoming of us as Muslims to be speaking in that manner. Coming back to choosing friends wisely, that doesn't mean to discard companions that you feel you can make some leeway with, that you can advise. And remember, the deen is advice, a deen and nasiha. And it's got to be sincere. Because in the day and age that we're in, when we're advising a friend, when we're advising a brother or advising a sister, that's to it. Sometimes, more often than not, it's to impose our view upon them. And if they don't follow what we've advised them, then we castigate and we chastise them. And we even transfer that to another friend. And I advised them about this. They didn't listen. This is why I'm staying away from them. No, if it's advice, it's advice. And it should be sincere, because you're loving for them what you love for yourself. And you need to flip it around and ask yourself, if they were advising me in the same way with the same intention that I may have regarding them, would it make me feel comfortable or uncomfortable? And I think that's important. And Hassan, if you want to put up some more questions, I know Wajid has dropped for the moment and we're waiting for him to connect back. That's fine. A question from Reactionary here. Should Muslims not be protesting against shirk and kufr as opposed to protesting about racial discrimination, which is worse? Very good question. Welcome back, Wajid. I'll just answer this question. Very good question. I think that it's not about protesting about shirk and kufr. That is part and parcel of our being, of our DNA, if you like, as Muslims. That not only should everything we do should be the antithesis to shirk and kufr. So that's continuous from the moment they're lifted from us and we move in this world as young men, women, husbands, wives, sons, daughters. So that's if you want, that's a revolutionary protest that epitomizes our very being and lives as Muslims. And that is much more important than protesting about the secondary, elementary, or subsidiary causes of shirk and kufr. Remember with Iblis, he committed shirk and kufr in disobeying a command from Allah to prostrate to Adam. And he disobeyed. That disobedience was a level of disbelief in kufr that was premised by xenophobia, thinking that he was better than Adam. So they run very, very closely. So while we are fighting and epitomizing that struggle against disbelief and associating partners with Allah, we've also got to know that that means as well we fight against discrimination. And our problem, as we've been speaking about in previous shows, Wajid and I have touched upon this from weeks ago, we have this endemic problem in the Muslim world amongst the more predominant communities, South Asian, Arabs in the West, with racism, anti-black racism. So while we are upholding and standing for Tawheed, as we say we are, in actuality, if we are true muwahids, then we should abhor racism. Yet we don't. So what does that say? And this is just me asking the question, what does that say about the comprehensiveness of our understanding regarding Tawheed? And I'll hand back to Wajid. Welcome back.
Just a slight technical issue there. Jazakallah khair. And just to build on what you've said there, Dr. Abdul, it's that internal balance that needs to be right. You know, when it comes to Tawheed, like you said, if we genuinely can look upon something and we see it as an injustice, that we say that it is an injustice. You know, there's the hadith of the woman who feeds the dog with her shoe. If he feeds it with water, because the animal is going through hardship, but she shows compassion. She shows what is right towards another creature of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And by doing so, she gains her place in Jannah. And so, you know, for us to measure things, and this is, I suppose, this is what kind of where we go, kind of like this idea of having achieved a level, or I've achieved this amount of education, or achieved this kind of level, therefore I've reached my status, I'm on that mountain, and I'm not going back, is in some ways, yes, it works in some parts of our lives, but when it comes to our own self, we talked about, you know, self-identity, self-determination, and complementing facets of our identity, it's something that has to be consciously worked on daily. You know, we have to work on daily. We have to focus and find ourselves in those waves of activity. You know, when we have downtime, when we have uptime, when we are focusing and diligent in our ibadah. And in ibadah, as we know, you know, as Muslims, it's not just on the prayer mat. It's not just in that building that's called a mosque. It's a day-to-day, morning till, well, waking up till you go to sleep process. And I think it's that which I feel we miss out when we look at things too from we miss out that spiritual, that esoteric understanding of things and that connectivity. And I think I just going back to earlier within our conversation, I think that's the benefit we have when we speak to elders within our community, is they kind of take a step back and give you a different take on things that can really broaden our perception and our understanding.
Right. Yes, absolutely. Do you want to look at that question there from Reactionary about Rebecca Long-Bailey?
Rebecca Long-Bailey being sacked for retweeting a post mentioning US police training in Israel, and the Labour Party describing this as an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. Okay. Are you aware of this, Dr. Abdul Haqq?
I am aware of it. I can touch upon aspects of that. I think one of the things we've seen is that the Labour Party now, for example, after what they went through with Jeremy Corbyn, and I'm apolitical in a sense there. I don't get into the UK politics, even though my PhD is in political studies. But my point is the Labour Party is obviously very, very sensitive, looking at the battering that they got that time over the Semitism that was there. We saw that. I think that sensitivity is something that's prevalent in society, not just the Labour Party, and I think that it's something that needs to be acknowledged. However, not everything that you say in disagreement regarding Israel or a policy of theirs can be considered knee-jerk anti-Semitism. And that's what has begun to happen, or has been happening for quite a while now in that particular arena. And all I would say is this, because I'm not there and I don't follow that particular thread of politics too much, but if something is anti-Zionist, that does not equate automatically to anti-Semitism. Because you've even got Jews who are anti-Zionism, and no one speaks concerning them. I think amongst the Jewish faith, they marginalize them. Those who are Zionists marginalize them, make them out to be crackpots and individuals like that. So anti-Zionism, from my understanding, does not equate to anti-Semitism. Not saying that this thing that Rebecca Long tweeted was either of those. She referred, from what I understood from the media reports, she referred to a strategy of kneeling on the neck and suffocating individuals in America, like George Floyd, being learned from the Israeli forces.
Yeah,
that's all she tweeted. She highlighted, this is where they learned it from. This is what happens there. And those of you who have not seen, you only have to go and look up on YouTube and everything. You'll see that is a regular practice of the IDF with young teenage boys as well as men in practice. So she was drawing a parallel from what I saw, and we saw Keir Starmer take a very decisive step on her retweeting something which was an apparent reality. And this is the problem now, and this is the point I want to come to. We are living in environments where it's okay to speak about one thing as long as it's not referring to a particular caucus or contingent or constituency. But if that same thing is spoken about over here and it refers to another constituency, then it's okay. And I'll speak to the point and conclude on the point I'm making. So, for example, understandably, and we acknowledge the trauma that our Jewish religion adherents went through with the Holocaust and everything with Nazi Germany. Understood, acknowledged, abhorrent. And it's fresh in the memory and it's relived. The world relives it, commemorates it, and everything. But now let's bring another parallel that's centuries longer than that. The oppression of Black people that's been institutionalized and is there structurally. And whenever that's raised, there are diminishing voices that we cannot speak about it. Reparations are raised and it's diminished. God forbid that we claim and say we want land, like what happened with the inception and what happened at Nakaba.
right.
The double standards that are there because of the power and pressure groups that support them, amongst them governments, politicians, policies, will always cause conflict and resistance as long as there's this double standard and dissonance regarding causes that are one and the same and as acute or more acute than the ones that we are upholding and being silenced over speaking. What I've said here is profound, and I will welcome comeback from this, because I want that to be answered by those who continue to do this, diminishing something because it refers to one ethnicity, black in this instance, allowing all sorts of statements like Starkey, the racist statement that John Starkey, or whatever his name is, mentioned very recently. The fact he has been a publisher and he's held these views, he's sat on seats of authority, and he's made racist statements before, but he made this statement here. And it's only now that he's being picked up about that.
Yeah, it wasn't.
Imagine he made that statement. Imagine he made that statement concerning another faith, another ethnicity. We most probably see him in prison. Double standards. And if we cannot change those double standards, it's not going to stop us speaking about them. I've answered that question comprehensively and taken it in a particular direction, because I think it's important to do that. You can speak about one thing, you can't speak about another thing that's identical to that. Why not? Why not?
I think the way it was said was that this is sort of an anti-Semitic trope that gets bandied about around this stuff, because the IDF and even the police in America say they are not taught to put their knee on somebody to restrain them. Even though we see it, that's not part of the training. That just happens to be how a soldier or a police officer in that instance has reacted to that situation. And I think the nuances of that, because ultimately it's the Israeli government that is carrying out these decisions, and that their people are putting them into practice. Yeah. So when it comes to these kind of things, drawing parallel, like you said, that what's going on with the Israeli government, whether you look at what's going on in Yemen, in Syria, with the Uyghur concentration camps in China, there is an endless list of horrendous activity that is going on, that is being inflicted upon millions of people. And again, going back to what you said, that this has been inflicted in the open upon Black people without even it's just one of those things, like recently, I know, for example, when we talk about Little Britain, it was taken off the air because some of the characters, for lack of a better word, and they blacked up, right? And we're talking about in this century, we're not talking about any further away from that. Whereas I remember younger days when the idea of minstrels was offensive, right? White actors would face, cliche, negative kind of derogatory versions of Black people to entertain and to sing, as you sort of discussed earlier.
Right.
And yet, even though that was said about that still echoed through to this century, and people still did it without any very clear uproar.
Right.
And again, more than likely, being put forward for accolades and awards. So I think it has to be clear when we talk about these things, who we are exactly defining this to. And it is the Israeli government that is allowing these policies to go through. And they are the ones who are the accountable body in this. In the same way,
yes,
we would hold our own government to account on this, or that we talk about, let's say Donald Trump or the chair, the president of China, or
yes,
Putin, or this, so on and so forth. Because ultimately, it is these people who are making these decisions and allowing these things to carry on. And I think what happens as well is, and we've seen this specifically with Trump very clearly highlighting this idea of bad apples. And I think there are certain jobs where you cannot have a bad apple.
Right? No, that's
you
right.
You cannot go and see a doctor who's a bad apple. You can't do that, right? You're going to end up with a Dr. Shipman scenario, or you're just going to end up in mortal danger because of
Right.
negligence and idiocy.
Right.
So there are certain careers where should be a zero tolerance
Absolutely.
on any kind of rotting in the core or otherwise, because ultimately it is going to have an effect on the credibility and authenticity of what that thing is there to do. So whether that's to do
Right.
with law, whether it's to do with medicine, or yeah, and again, sort of the policing service, which comes under law, and
Right.
it's those things that I think we need to be very clear on, yeah, because I have met Israeli people, I have met Jewish people, and I met people on both sides of that conversation of saying that Israel is doing wrong, but it's the Israeli government that is implementing laws and
Right.
practice that is wrong, that is international law that it's violating. The Israeli government is choosing to do that. The current prime minister, president, whatever it is
And I think I'm glad you've raised that. I think that's an important thing, because when we're talking about governments, and I'll come back to that point there, and I try to highlight this when speaking with younger individuals, anti-Semitism is when you start bringing up and raising hatred against Jews. This is problematic. This is very problematic. And why is Abdul Haqq saying this? No, it is problematic. We have in our book that we can eat the meat of the Ahl Kitab, including the Jewish faith. We can marry among them. Okay. That is perfectly permissible to do. Some of my children have Jewish parentage, grandparents, okay, frankly, from my ex-wife. And this is not why I'm saying that. But if we understand our deen properly, and we look to that as our criteria, we would understand, as I've mentioned, anti-Zionism. Zionism is not the same as what we're looking at with regards to Judaism. One is a construct and ideology, and that's about the hegemonic gains and development and establishment of an Israeli state and everything that comes around that. So we cannot, and Muslims have to be very careful here when they speak of the Jewish faith and Jews. They cannot speak with anti-Zionism. This is incorrect. This is my personal understanding of it. This is incorrect. It's wrong. It should not be done. Demarcation has to be very, very clear. And our religion shows us that. And we even have examples of how our Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was with Jewish neighbors. Visiting the dying child of one of them on his deathbed when he realized he was dying, and he went and sat with him. And he told him, he invited him to take the Shahada. And the Jewish son looked at his father, looked at his Jewish father. The hadith, the narration is authentic. And his father nodded, he said, go ahead. And before that child died, he took his Shahada at the behest of our messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So when you've got this in mind, how does it equate to the anti-Jewish stance that some Muslims have on the whole? It doesn't equate to what I've just mentioned here. Now, I'm not flipping it around and saying, okay, turn a blind eye, what's going on in Palestine and everything like that. No, as you said, the government is implementing particular policies. Direct what needs to be directed towards the right cause, direction where it should go. And in that instance, the Jewish government. But at the same time now, we've got to be very careful that it shouldn't become a taboo word, that if we're going to criticize, that we're shut down as it's anti-Semitism, shut down your website, ban this individual, he's this, blacklist him, because you can't say boo about an injustice emanating from a particular region or particular peoples. That cannot be right. There's got to be a balance. And we are those who are here along that pathway of balance. And so we need to know what it is to be upon it.
Yeah. And I think we touched on it, I mean, not in this direct way, but we discussed this at the beginning when we were talking about that when it comes to injustice, And we see it across the world, like we said. I mentioned Myanmar. I didn't mention Myanmar, but Myanmar. You see the horrific, what's going on there. The concentration camps in China, as I mentioned, Yemen, Syria. It's just literally across the world. But when we talked about it, we said that when our black brothers and sisters would unify on this, even on the issue of Kashmir, to stand up and say that what is going here is wrong and it is oppressive and it needs to be dealt with. And it is on that basis that we stand up to say that.
Right.
It is not about, because if I'm correct, the Prophet ﷺ said not to hate anything so much that you could not love it, and not to love anything so much that you could not hate it. And that meant, you may have good friends, but they do things that are so wrong that you can't distance yourself, and you coddle them too much, and you don't do
Right.
the right thing by them. But you might hate
Yes.
something. But then, like you said, that like Abu Sufyan, when Abu Sufyan became Muslim and Hind became Muslim, the Prophet ﷺ did not hate her to that extent where he wasn't able to accept her as a Muslim. And there has to be this thing where it is hating the injustice and that removal of injustice that is fundamental and vital,
Right.
for what is within us. And we were talking about those pillars within ourselves, is that it isn't that, because people can change, and we see that.
Yes.
And that's ultimately what a movement is about. So when we have these moments of discussion and openness, that we are allowed to have those interactions, but it's done in a way, like you said, never to look down upon someone, but never to allow it just to be festering hate, which is xenophobic, really. It has no real foundation or
Right.
understanding to it. It's about really understanding the individual and connecting, so that we can understand, but we can also be able to say that there is an injustice here, and this injustice.
As Allah says in the Quran, so is Surah Ma'idah, in two places Allah says, do not let your hatred of a people lead you to transgression. Be just.
Yeah, be just.
That's there.
That is such a big word, just, because it removes oppression, it removes revenge, it removes personal opinion, it removes so many emotions from it, and it brings
Right.
what is right that needs to be dealt with, subhanAllah.
Yes.
And I think that is really where it comes down to, that it is, as Muslims, we need to be that conscious and aware of not this whole idea of being silenced or thing, but actually looking at what the core issue is and addressing it at where it is, as opposed to
that focus. Yes,
that's it. Yeah. So alhamdulillah, jazakallah khair. So just another thing, by brother Abdul Haqq, Ruth Rasulullah is doing oppression in the world, then we need to stand in public against the oppressor. And again, I think we've
we've covered that, but what I will address that for Sister Salwa, who's a regular viewer, mashallah. Sister Salwa, that's a very good question, but then we need to put that question in line with what is from the Sunnah. And you'll see from the Sunnah that in revolting openly against the ruler, it always, more often than not, results in bloodshed, further repression, and harm to the people who have revolted, not only to them, but everyone else, the entire society. And I've referred to particular chapters. If you look in Sahih Muslim and Sahih Bukhari, the book's called Kitab al-Fitan. And when I first came to the deen, and since then, when you read narration after narration after narration, it gives examples of what happened as a result of revolting against the ruler in this way, protesting against the Muslim ruler publicly. And and I see you're saying if someone is sinning in public, then we correct and advise in public. And if someone is sinning in secret, then we advise one on that person only. Absolutely correct. But you're talking about another person. You may be talking about a popular speaker You may be talking about someone who's not in leadership. These narrations are specific to people in leadership, in positions of authority. And these are from the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then we have the athar and the narrations of the companions. So I'm not bringing this to water down what you're saying. It's a very, very important point. But then what I say, yes, we do need to fight against sin. And there are levels. Remember, I mentioned about enjoining, the levels of enjoining good and the forbidding evil. And when you read the explanations around that particular hadith, there's one thing here, Sister Salwa, and I think that this will resonate with you as it does with me and everyone else, mashallah. When the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when the conquest of Makkah took place, shortly after that, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was with Aisha radiallahu anha. And he said to her, he looked at the Kaaba and he told her, if it was not for the newness of the people to Islam, I would have destroyed the current construction of the Kaaba and rebuilt it to its original foundations. So he opted against bringing down the Kaaba as it was at that time and rebuilding it to its original foundations of Ibrahim and Ismail alayhim assalam.
Had been moved, basically.
Yes, and it wasn't the same construct. So what was taken from that as a principle, and it's one that we adhere to today, that if in enjoining a good, it is likely to lead to a greater evil, it is impermissible to enjoin that good. If in you wanting to enjoin a good, it's a good, it's genuinely a good, it's going to result in a greater evil, it's not permissible to go ahead with it.
It reminds
That's
me
the principle.
about the usefulness stage, because when we have knowledge, we see it very black and white. But the implementation,
Yes.
the idea is abstract, and the idea of actually understanding how we put it into practice and how we do that. And ultimately, it's about relationships, right? Like, you know,
Absolutely. And this is a good point.
She's advising her sister to tone down her language. Now, if the relationship is good, as annoying as it is for the person who's doing the bad thing, and I say that as somebody who was doing some things like that, is that as annoying as it is, it still sticks with you. You know, actually, you know what? As annoying, as angry as I was that he told me off for it, he's actually right. You know, he's right in what he's saying, and that's slow, but that's only right in what he's saying because I have respect and love for the guy. You know, like as a brother and as a friend. So it's so yeah, it's we have to, because the deen is nasiha, the deen is rahma, the deen is all of these things, you know. And Jazakallah khair, Sister Salwa, for staying with us. We've kind of gone well over time, actually. We're heading towards Maghrib time in Newcastle, subhanallah. So
like, can we tie that point up with as Sister Salwa was going?
Yeah.
If she comes back and sees this point as well, the analogy from the hadith of the ship. If we look today at those who scuttled the bottom of the boat and made it sink, and then we only have to look at the result and the continuing embers of the so-called Arab Spring. We just have to look at that. And if anyone can say that that was successful across the Arab and Muslim world, I'd love to hear that from them. Because we can ask a simple question. Are these societies in a better condition than before? And I won't answer. This is for individuals to look at that honestly and say, look across Egypt, Libya, Syria, Yemen, Tunisia. Answer. And don't get me wrong, there was oppression and the people were fed up and we empathize with them. And what they were enduring was terrible. But we are a people upon the way of prophetic guidance, as easy as it may be sometimes, or as difficult as it may be sometimes. We are upon that way and not our emotions. And that's what I will say to end on that particular point.
Okay, inshallah. Am I allowed to add something? Is that okay?
Of course, of course.
Yeah. Okay. So what I would say is, yes, it's easy sometimes to look at something and go, it's just wrong. But you talked about impatience, but I still remember the reading about when the Prophet ﷺ went first time to do Hajj, right? So the Muslims are in strength. They've got an army.
Yes.
They've got a stronghold in Medina. SubhanAllah. They're ready to go. And on the route, they are stopped by people from the Quraysh, from Mecca. And they say, don't, you can't come. And you have to sign this treaty. And you have to resign these rights. And you have to do this, this, and this, and this. Right? Now, Umar radiallahu at that time is like, right, it's on. Yeah. You know, like there's no way they can treat us like this. Not now.
That's right.
Not now when we have strength. Not now when we have the authority and the power, and we have the army, and we can do this. And the Prophet ﷺ said, "Not yet." You know, just.
That's right.
You know, just not yet. You know, and Prophet ﷺ signed that treaty, and you know, Umar radiallahu anhu was fuming with this. He was so angry about it, and he felt like they were being wronged, and they were being wronged, blatantly being wronged and ostracized and persecuted further, despite them being, you know, more powerful and being able to stand up for themselves. But the Prophet ﷺ, in their, you know, wisdom and in their, subhanallah, the guidance from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, said, not yet. And then when they did,
Allah revealed after that, as they were returning, you have Surah Fat, the 48th surah, you've achieved a great victory. Subhanallah.
Yeah. And so these things need reflecting. They need pondering upon, and they need understanding. And it is that understanding that allows us to tap into our innate, what we call our fitrah, that innate nature that makes us human, that softens the heart, and that gives us the light, the nur of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala inside us that guides us. You know, whatever little knowledge that is, it becomes wisdom, and it becomes something that puts us, in every moment of our lives, inshallah. Subhanallah.
Right.
Subhanallah. Okay. Right. So last week, book of the week. Quickly finish on that, brother, because it was Akala's book. Yeah.
That's right.
We brought that up. To this week was I think you mentioned it before.
Tina Rosenberg.
Join the club.
Positive, but join the club. Positive peer group pressure. I think that's very appropriate. She gives different examples in that book of positive peer group, and it should be a reasonable price now. You can get it on Kindle as well, and some good examples, different examples from around the world of organizations, how positive peer group transformed individuals' lives and societal and environmental events. So this is very apt with what we've discussed this evening, and this has been a marathon, but I think a good one.
But
we've lost some weight.
Yeah, I've learned, certainly, as mashallah I do every Monday, and it does me till next Monday, so I'm good for the week now. But again, just looking at sort of this idea of the ideal character, and really just trying to understand that, you know, it comes down to enjoining the good and forbidding the evil, believing in something bigger and better than yourself, and, you know, leadership and defining yourself, knowing where you are in order to move into a place where you can really start to know yourself, recognize yourself, find that sort of friendship of who you associate with, because it's going to get you where you want to be. You know, nobody does it on their own. Nobody does it on their own. And I think that's been the strong message that's come through for me today. So Jazakallah khair, Abdul Haqq, Dr. For your time this evening. Thank you all to our viewers and listeners who persevered. I appreciate it. Has been a longer session, but we've touched on some real issues, and hopefully, inshallah, we've unpacked them. Any comments, any feedback, you know what, we're open to it. Bring it. Please bring it, because if it helps us to be better Muslims, we're up for it. If it helps us to be better in the sense of, you know, what I mean to Muslims is that better human beings, increases our understanding and makes us more better people in our society and the community. Bismillah, you know, we're up and ready for it, inshallah. And Jazakallah khair for all of your time. Please like, subscribe, and get in touch. And inshallah, we look forward to catching up with you, inshallah, next Monday. So from us here at Newcastle Fast FM and our esteemed guest, that's right, Dr. Abdul Haqq. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.